for the contour tab, we have some information in here that is pretty important to making the machining come out correct. The first one is the side parameters. An allowance is set to 0 because remember I said a contour mill is a finish pass, so it will machine to the size that we need it to machine to. And then if I go to settings, you have the ability to adjust your side parameters as well as your bottom parameters. You can see as I click on these different pieces of information, the images update. They're all set for 0. If this was a rough pass or you wanted to make multiple passes because of tool flex, this is where you would adjust any of that information. If you turn on single depth cut, that will finish everything to the bottom. If it is unchecked, then it will make several passes to that depth. For our example, we'll just leave them at 0. And then for corners, you have the ability to leave a rounded or a sharp corner. And one of my favorites here is you have the ability to do sharp corners to where it just feeds around straight. You have the ability to do a loop where it'll come out, create a loop, which will hopefully deburr that corner for you and make it perfectly sharp. And then you have the ability to do rounded, where it would actually put a small radius on those corners. So instead of doing deburring afterwards, you have the ability to change that setting. And you can adjust the radius that you want that to be. So let's say you want it to be 5 thousandths, then it'll automatically put a 5 thousandths radius on it. You do not need to change the SolidWorks model to put those in to get your tool paths. I love using this tool here, to be honest. For corner machining, if you turn that on, then you can set your max or minimum radius, and that'll determine how the corner and the tool path automatically gets set. And you can see in the preview, it may start and come around and then loop through, depending upon how you have the minimum and max radius set. If it's turned off, you get the normal traditional milling like what you would expect. So for here, we're just going to set it back to sharp because for this example, it'll work that way. And then we're going to talk about our depth parameters. The depth parameters generally are tricky for people when they first start using it because there's two settings in here that you really need to understand and utilize to the best of your ability. The first one is the first cut amount depth. Now, what that means is as I come out here and I come to feed into my part on stock, what is the first pass I'm going to make? How deep is that? And you may be asking yourself, well, what does that matter? Because I always come in and I just go 1/4 inch down on everything with a 3/8 Endmill, and that's just how I do it. Well, the reason this exists is when I used to do a lot of aerospace stuff, what we would do is we would take a great big huge block of aluminum that may take 150 hours to machine, and you don't want to come in and just mill a 1/4 inch out of it and then do your first pass inspection and realize it's wrong because it costs too much money to scrap a big piece of aluminum. What we would do is we would set this first cut amount at, say, 2/1000ths of an inch. So essentially the end mill would come and just scribe out the shape or the tool path. And then we could stop the machine and we could do our check and fit and make sure everything is set the way it needs to set without having any chance of ruining the part. So the first cut amount can be used to do first article inspection or verification to make sure that, let's say, your 0 is in the right spot and the part is actually going to be centered in the block that you're going to machine it out of. By default, it's, as this one was set, it was set to 10 inches. This can vary. But one thing to make sure is you don't end up with, if this button is on, this is a percentage of the depth. I generally always work in how far I want it to go because in my mind I know if I'm going to cut 3 inches deep, maybe I want to make the first one at 10 thousandths. So it'll make a 10 thousandths pass. And then everything after that, you can do a max cut amount of, let's say we got a 1/4 inch tool. Let's say we make any other pass after that can be an 1/8 inch deep or 125 deep. And then what CamWorks will do is CamWorks will parse up all the rest of that to fit between this first 10 thousandths and 125 depth till it gets to the bottom. Now, depending upon tool flex and flood coolant and what type of pocket, how deep it is, you have the ability to then come back and say, my final cut that I want to do, I want to do a 30 thousandths cleanup on the bottom. And if I set those numbers like that, it'll take a 10 thousandths first cut, it'll use up to 125 thousandths depth for every subsequent cut, and then when I get to the bottom, my final bottom finish pass will be 30 thousandths deep. And setting those three numbers, you can pretty much control exactly how that pocket's going to run and let CamWorks do all the math and adjustment to make it work. Now, we also have the ability to do depth processing by level or by region. And what that would mean is if this was a big mold and tool mold, and I had a bunch of pockets at different depths, CamWorks will program accordingly on if I'm just going to machine everything by a level or if I'm going to go to depth by region. And what that means is for each region I'm machining, I'm just going to take it all the way to depth and then I'm going to move over to the next pocket. Some people like to machine everything and go down in steps across the entire part at once. Some people like to just go mill out of pocket and then call it a day. It's really personal preference. Cut method, climb or conventional. We're all comfortable with that, conventional cutting, climb cutting. And then for flat areas, you have the ability to turn this on. And this is a pretty cool setup here too for bottom finish. And if I hit this preview, what it'll do is as there are islands or flat areas in your part, so let's say this flat face here stuck up 4 inches before this one, but I'm machining down in depth and I may not have the correct increment to finish that. If you turn this on, then it will automatically come back and finish this top as it's moving down with everything around it. And you have the ability to use high speed where you can do rounds and sharps and S-curves on how the tool paths are to streamline that process. You can also set your retract, your entry. It gives you a lot more granularity for bottom finishing the flat areas as it goes down.